everyone. This is Edwin Braun of Cebas Visual Technology, creator of thinkingParticles. And I'm here watching an amazing tutorial in thinkingParticles. And yeah, I'll pass on to you, Callum, and say something about you.
Yep, I'm Callum Welsh. I'm a senior art director at Random42. Random42 is a scientific communication company based in Soho in the UK, or London, UK. Scientific communication kind of encompasses a few things. We primarily do medical animations, but it also sort of picks up stuff like image work, booth design, and recently we've also been looking into VR and interactive stuff, including like augmented reality that you see through phones and tablets and the such. So we did a web publication interview recently, and there were like a few scenes at the end where I kind of gave a little bit of a breakdown as to how we did it. One of the ones that didn't appear but we kind of hinted at was this blood vessel system. So this is just like the R&D and then the final shot. And I thought we would go through how I set it up in TP. We kind of do quite different stuff in TP. We're not doing the usual kind of destruction work. So I like to think we kind of use TP a little bit differently to what I usually see out there. So
yeah, that's cool. That's really cool stuff. So let's see how you did it.
Cool. So I just do like a bit of a breakdown as to what's been shown. So we've got a blood vessel rupture here, which causes internal bleeding, which is obviously very bad. Yeah. So we're showing the natural body response in this case. So the first level is we have this stuff called von Willebrand, which kind of big balls of protein, and they attach to collagen and kind of spool across. It's not shown in this system. We have shown it in other systems, but in this one we kind of didn't need to go into that complexity. But it kind of creates this spider web, and this allows these platelets to bind. So they bind to receptors, which are almost like these little hooks on this von Willebrand. And when they bind to these receptors, they activate. So they start transforming and they grow these little tentacles. And once they create this first layer and they activate, they recruit additional cells. They come, and these additional cells form this large mass. So now the rupture is pretty much sealed. Fibrin is then deposited. So fibrin are these little proteins that are in the blood vessel. They come along, they get deposited, they connect together to create this kind of netting across it to stabilize the clot. In this case, we're looking at a disease state, so this netting isn't strong enough to create a stable clot. It actually breaks off, and now you have a big mass of cells that have gone into your bloodstream. And obviously, if the blood vessel narrows, you can get clots, which can be quite bad for you, kind of kill you in some cases. So we have 3ds Max here. Just got a little spline here, and I'll sort of go through how we set it up. The first thing is we just want to get some cells following the path with a nice pulsing animation to kind of mimic the heart pumping blood around the body. Mm-hmm. So what I like doing is I'll just create a little selection set for the TP so I can pick it up at any point, and I'll just create some basic hierarchy as well.
Yeah, this is what we suggest in for every starter in TP. We say name the stuff so that later you can easily understand what you did. Because as you grow with your setups, it can get very complex, especially when you add more and more effects. It's always a good idea to name this accordingly.
Yeah, it seems a bit slow at first, but you always want to force yourself into it. And another one of those is, so I've just created hierarchy of all the blood vessel. It's really nice for like caching, and if you add other TPs, you can have like, a layer for each particle system. If I use position born, which is pretty much the standard spawning in here. And what I like to do is whenever I create a group, I will assign it a color. I've kind of trained myself that if I see white particles in the scene, that's, something's gone wrong, something's been misassigned somewhere. So I always like to give them colors so I know that only white particles are going to be problematic. We'll put these into cells, we'll just spawn a rate, we'll mash some 9s, they live for a long time, and that's about it. So they'll spawn off world 0, 0, 0, and then we'll just very simply take these cell groups and add a path follow to them. Pick the object, and now they should follow down that path. A few things we just want to do. Oh, kind of lost it a bit. They are exactly on the path. If we come in and add a distance of 30, that will push them out 30 units from that. And if we increase the variation to 100%, we kind of get like a little slice along there. We can rotate these round. So if we do 90 degrees, they're obviously rotate around 90 degrees. But if we set that to 360 degrees in the variation, we have essentially the particles are revolved around the path, which is what we want. Now in this, for the speed, there's two options. We can either define the speed inside the node, or we can inherit the speed that's been set on the particle. So at the moment, when we spawn the particle, the default speed is set to 10. If I increase that to like 100, they will now go 100 times faster, because that's what the path follow is currently picking up. It's picking up the speed that's already exists in the particle. So what we can do for a pulsing behavior is if we create another dynamic before the path follow, we can take our cells, add a velocity node, and then if we expose the speed, we can add some custom speed in here. I want to only be adding speed. If I add speed in direction, it screws up the velocity, so you'll see that they kind of get stuck at the end here because it's overriding kind of what the path follow direction is being given, so we only want to add the speed here. Alright, so speed anim, and all I'm going to do is just key by hand the kind of pulsing behavior I want. And I'm going to do it between 0 and 1 just to normalize it. So if we have frame 0 is 1, frame 10 is 1, frame 15 goes down to 0, frame 25 is at 0, and then we go back up to 1. Something like this. So that's all I've made, is this little animation. And then I can loop it, range, loop. And so this is when the flow is on, this is when the flow is off, so we should get a nice pulsing to it.
So just talk a little bit here, if that's okay with you. So what we just saw is one way how you can use TP, and there's many ways to do these things, and that clearly shows how nice TP is integrated into the Max workflow, because you can use the track view, you can use keyframes, everything that's in Max will also work in TP. And what you just did here, you could also do fully procedural with other TP nodes, where the pulsing comes from, example, from a value to value, where you can draw this curve you just saw in track view. You can also draw this curve in TP and use that as a pulse that you feed into speed. I just want to mention that that's the great thing about TP, that it's so flexible. So, okay, just go ahead. I just wanted to mention that there's several options to do it, and whatever is good and fast for you is fine with TP. And
yeah, exactly what you say. There's usually more than one way to approach something, and I may not be approaching something the best way. I kind of learned TP somewhat in isolation. We didn't really have anyone here who knew TP to teach us, so we learned it. So we might be doing things different ways. There might be more efficient ways, but we get the end result.
Yeah, and that's what counts. I think that's totally fine. And that's also what we had as an idea when we created TP. It should be just a flexible tool where people can do whatever they dream of, and that's the whole idea.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like if you look at something like Fume that feels like it just kind of does smoke or fire, TP, I feel like I can make so many different types of systems. I mean, kind of shown in the interview, and there's some other videos on the YouTube and Vimeo where I show some other examples. We've done neuron signaling, bacteria dividing. We've done like quite a breadth of different things through the one system. It doesn't feel like it's really shoehorned into just doing one type of effect. So I've got this speed anim between 0 and 1, just kind of like normalized, and then the way I want to do it is multiply it with another value, and this just means that if I ever want to make the particles go, I don't want to do that with auto key on. If I ever want to make the particles go faster, I don't have to go back into the curve editor, so that's just kind of like my preferred way of doing that. We will have a problem though, so I'm trying to make it so it falls into the same pitfalls I kind of fell in when I came up with this. So we'll see that the particles, they'll spawn out, they'll slow down, but then they kind of don't have speed reapplied to them. Those on speed. So one of the reasons we're doing this, I drew a really awful picture. So velocity is a vector, an x, y, and z. I've simplified it here just to x and y. So this particle moves from this point to the next point, 3 in the x, 4 in the y. The speed is the length of that, which is 5. If we multiply this down to 0, we actually lose the x and the y, and we can't multiply back up from 0. So we're losing its direction, which is one of the reasons why we can't like inject speed back into them. So there's a few ways around it. The kind of easiest way, select TP. If you ever get that you can't show track view, just make sure the TP is selected. And then I think it's because it's already open. Yep. Is just make it so it never goes down to 0. So we can make it so it goes down to near 0, 0.001, but it always keeps its direction. And now what we should have.
And you replace the value, so everything that comes in. So what is the speed anim?
So that's just between 0 and 1. I can like just debug that to 1 for now. So 1 gets multiplied up to 100. That's a plus. Why is that plus? I swear I changed it. Oh, it's because I had auto key on. I'm so mad.
You animated it.
The magic of editing. All right, so now what we have is, because I didn't change that to mult. There we go. So now what we have is the cells have this pulsing animation where they go at 100 speed and then they drop down to pretty much no speed and then they pick up again. So this kind of is mimicking the pulsing, and obviously because this is an animated value, we can go in and adjust it quite easily. So if we wanted it to have it like a longer stretch of time before it slows down, and then maybe like they stay still for longer. So it's very nice for artistic control. The next thing I want to do is, this is a little bit plain at the moment. I want to have them twist around the path as they are moving as well. So if we go into path follow, we're kind of showing off the rotation earlier. We can set the rotation around the path. If we expose the age and expose the rotation, we can plug those in, and what we will get is the rotation will keep adding, and you'll get this. It's a little bit extreme at the moment. If I just take the age and divide it down a little bit, create a float, call it something like rock divisor, divide that, and we'll divide it by about 10 or something. So now they rotate around or twist around the path. But we do have an issue, which is it looks a bit weird that it's still rotating at the same speed when there is no pulse being applied. So we want to fix that. And the way to do that, we're going to start delving into memories. Memories was kind of one of those ones where it took me a little while to get used to it, but if you come from Houdini and you use create attributes, it's very similar to that. So if we get the cell group and we visible all, this is all the data or attributes attached to each particle. So the particle holds a position, a velocity, lifespan, age, size, all this stuff. All we want to do is add another little one at the bottom, which is our own custom. And so we can hold the rotation. So each particle can hold a rotation around the path. So we got our memory node. I usually rename it because when we start creating multiple memories, they stack up. So it's a little bit easier to find, and also it means that you don't delete this, because if you delete this, you attach the data you create to the node. So you just want to make sure that you don't delete the actual master memory node that's holding all your data. So we right-click on memory in the tree view, and we choose our data type. Scalar is fine in this case. We'll call it rotation. We'll drag it in as an input, plug our born particle into it, and then just to make sure we set it to 0. I think it defaults to 0, but I'm just overriding it just to be doubly sure.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, and it's also nice to look back on and see what's happening.
Yeah.
Cool. So now if we go into the velocity pulse, we're going to kind of do two memories. We're going to do like a scripting kind of operation, I guess, where you take a variable and you +1 to it, and then you save that variable out, like the time in ++ or time equals time +1.
Yeah. And the great thing here with the memory operator is it's across all dynamic sets. So that's a huge advantage. You can use this everywhere and access the memory value in every and each dynamic set, regardless where it is in your hierarchy. So that's a very powerful feature there.
I really like it. You can expand things so much. I mean, it might look scary to begin with, but I mean, if you can get your head around it, it opens up so many doors in terms of what you can do, and hopefully we'll show off some examples later. So all I'm doing is I'm taking the rotation, I'm adding 1 to it every subsample in this case. So do be wary that if you change the subsampling, at the moment it's set to per frame, but if I was to increase this to per half frame or 120, which would be 4 samples per frame, it would add 4 times as much, so you'd have to like divide this to compensate. But yeah, I'm just adding 1 and then saving it. So frame 0, rotation equals 0, it adds 1 to it, saves it out. Frame 2, it brings in that 1, adds another 1 to it, it now saves it out as 2. And it's just going to kind of mimic the age channel. So if I come in here, bring the memory, and plug that instead of the age, I should end up with the same result, where it's twisting around, which is great. I've just created the exact same result. How's that useful? Yeah. If we go back here, instead of adding 1, what we can do is we can add that animation value that we've got between 0 and 1, that normalized speed animation. And the good thing about this is obviously when there's no pulse, this is set to 0, so you're not adding anything to your rotation. Your rotation's remaining the same. So now if we see this, I'll just play it. It's rotating during the pulse, but when there's no pulsing, it's not twisting around anymore. So it's looking a little bit more natural, and I might actually just increase the speed. And again, this is why having the speed as a separate multiplier is really handy, because I can increase it without having to go into the curve editor. And we got something like this. All right, next step. I'm just going to add a shape to it. I'll make it a cube now because it's a little easier to see rotation at this point in time, and I'll increase it to something like this. So our next issue here that we have is we've got some penetration, cells kind of clipping through each other, and we want to fix that. Actually, I'll just take a side to say as well, the path follow is a true path follow. I know, like I think pflow has an equivalent, which is more of a motion inheritance, but if I add noise through this path. And I could probably make this a little bit, ooh, not that nuts. I'm gonna have to do this pause. 50, 50, 50. We can have the path going all sorts of crazy, and those particles are locked to that path, so that's really, really nice. It means that if this was a blood vessel, for example, we could add some nice noise to it, make it feel really organic, and we know all the particles are going to move correctly. Anyway, yeah, so we want to make it so these are not penetrating each other, so I'm going to use the bullet physics for this. And I can't spell.
So you like bullet? Did you use it often or not so often?
I use bullet a lot.
Okay.
I mean, the two main reasons is, first of all, we can make it so things obviously don't collide or clip through each other, which obviously visually makes it look a lot nicer. But also, if we want to put a camera in the middle of this blood vessel, we don't want cells clipping through the camera. So if we put a bullet solver on them, we can make it so, put a sphere or a teardrop kind of shape around the camera, and the particles will go through it, and we can get some really awesome shots where the cells are just like flying either side of the camera.
Yeah, that's cool.
So I got a bullet physics. I have to assign it a rigid body shape, choose the collision. I'll choose a box primitive. I usually try and use primitives for bullet. We don't need to have the accuracy of having mesh collisions, so I usually keep it at primitives. When I'm working with cells, spheres are good enough. It just is much quicker for us to work. We have quite short project turnaround. And I'd rather spend time refining the motion of the system than making sure the collisions are 100% perfect.
Yeah.
So we'll choose our active group, which is the cells in this case, and we should have some bullet working. And hopefully, yeah, there we go. You'll see that we get this kind of very funky behavior where it's jittering all over the place. So the problem we've got here is the bullet physics is trying to reject these two meshes that are overlapping each other, but then the path follow is saying, it's also applying a force that's saying it must be at this point on the path, and they're kind of conflicting with each other. So the way of solving this would be to add a layer of another layer of particles to the system, and this is why, again, I like working with groups and stuff, because it means that I can quite easily add more complexity to the system without like having to undo all the work I've done. So what I can do is I can rename these these cells to helpers path follow, so we know that these are just giving us the path follow movement. I'll create a new group called cells, and we'll give them a color, and then we'll just do a little bit of tweak. So this should be all right. And we're going to spawn these new cells off our helpers, which are the ones that are following the path. And I'll just turn off the shapes for now. So I've created a new dynamic set under the path follow, and it needs to be under the path follow because without the path follow applied, they are spawning at world 000. Because we want them to spawn in the same position along the path, we want to do it after the path has been assigned. And we'll just call these spawn cells. We'll rename this to spawn helpers. We'll take our helpers, create a position born, and use that particle to spawn this, and we'll just make it so it spawns one particle every helper. We'll put it into the cells group. Again, we'll just give it some life, and we'll make it so it's got no speed. And we can just copy the shape from our old setup onto this. And now what we will have is it will spawn one of these cells every time a helper comes along. And we're going to use referencing. Referencing is one of those ones that I think is very important, fundamental of TP. It unlocks so many options. I usually try and think of it as I have a parent and a child. So in this case, my helpers are the parent, and I want to reference to the parent. So my cells are parented to the helpers. And what that's doing is just creating a link between the particles. If we create another dynamic after it, we can take our cells, use the getReference function, and now this particle is outputting our cell, and this particle here is outputting the relevant helper that it is linked to. And there's lots of cool things you can do with that. You can use it to pick up lots of data from its linked particle, like its position, its speed. You can even transfer memories as well. So if you had, like, say, the color assigned to a helper particle, and you want to transfer that color to the cells or anything like that. So it's really, really useful. I use it a lot for like placing particles. So I'll place particles somewhere in the scene where I specifically want my next level of particles to go, and then I just create references between them, and it just adds a lot of artistic control. In this case, I'm using the position follow. So I plug in my cells and the position I'm going to take from its reference particle, and I'm going to use the spring function and kind of liken it to having a rubber band between these two particles, and you can kind of see when I play it, you got this kind of lag.
Yeah.
And because it's giving some, or it's allowing some give, they're not having to be exactly on top. When we have the bullet, we just go back in the bullet and update this, so it's now the cells group that's going in. And also, just for good practice, if we're using bullet, we might as well create some hierarchy. So I'll just call this active bullet. Ooh. Put the cells in there, and it means that if I want to add anything else to the bullet, I'm adding it under this hierarchy as opposed to having to keep updating this. So now we should have proper collision. You can see they're not penetrating each other anymore because that rubber banding is allowing enough give, but it's also picking up the motion. And because it's kind of smoothing out the general motion, we're actually ending up with a much more fluid looking motion anyway. If I come back into velocity, I can, like, increase the speed variation to 50, increase the speed a little bit more. Actually, let's put that to what did I do? I think the variation's a little bit too high here.
Yeah.
I went a bit too crazy.
But it shows this nice organic movement. It's good.
And in fact, I might just turn the noise off the spline because it's a little bit distracting.
Yeah.
I think, like, a few people kind of surprised when you tell them that it's done using bullet and not with, like, the flow solver or something like that. They just assume it's because it's a more fluid looking motion or something.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so our next step is we're going to talk about how to mesh this. In the animation, there are 3 cells. If I bring this up, where's the good frame? So we've got a red blood cell here, we've got a platelet here, and we've got these T-cells. So we've got 3 cells that we want in the system. They are all different sizes as well. The platelet's very tiny, the T-cells are very large. And on top of that, they also have different proportions. So there's only a few T-cells, there's a lot of red blood cells and a lot of platelets. So we want to be able to control the proportions of the cells, and we want to control the size. But also, because later in the animation, we obviously have a lot of behavior happening. We have a lot of group changes as different behavior. I want to try and, instead of creating like 3 different groups, 1 for each cell, I want to try and keep it compact into 1 group. And that just keeps it very clean for when we start moving the particles between groups. So I mostly use frost for meshing. And there's a few reasons why I kind of prefer it. So firstly, I kind of like having the high res and the low res quite separate. I like in TP having it set up with like proxies or primitives and run really fast and be able to do all the TP, and then my Frost, I can just sort of check enable in viewport off, and then it will still render, but it won't calculate, so it keeps it very light. And finally, they also added, I just switched this to geometry, and then custom geometry here. They added V-Ray instancing recently as well, which means it's very, very quick to cache it into the render. Luckily for us as well, like TP and Frost communicate beautifully between each other. They're really, really good. All right, so I have some cells in the scene already. They are here. You'll notice that they are all relative to the same size. There are a few tracks that Frost will pick up by default from TP. So if I just select my TP object, so for example, if I go to orientation, say use orientation channel is something that TP outputs by default, and same with radius. The size of TP is output as radius, and Frost can pick that up with no extra work. Pick. Also, what's quite nice is, actually I'll expand this out for now, make it a little bit easier. If we go into thinking particle groups, we can also specify the groups. So for example, in our case, we don't want to mesh our helper cells or helper particles, only our cells. So we can choose to only mesh those groups. But yeah, if we use the size or the radius that TP outputs, we have to kind of prepare these within a 2x2x2 bounding box or a 1x1 radius. I don't want that. I want to display a box. -1. So if we look at all these cells, they all fit within that 2x2x2 bounding. And I guess the way to think of it is if you make a box in TP and you then give it a size, you're kind of multiplying that primitive by that size, and it brings in that primitive at a scale or size of 1 unit, and then if you give it a size of 20, it's just multiplying that up. And we have to do the same with Frost. If we want to use the size channel, we have to make sure everything fits within a 1 unit, and then we can multiply the size on top of that. We don't have to always use that. If we don't use radius channel and check this to 1, it will just take in 1-to-1 the size of the mesh. But where we might want to use radius is any time we want the TP to have scaling. So in this case, where the cells are leaking out of the blood vessel, I don't want to keep them going on forever, because that's obviously going to be not very optimal or efficient. But I want them to kind of scale down and then die, so it's a very subtle effect. It's not going to be a noticeable pop. And because I want scaling in that, that's why I have to use the radius channel, and I have to make sure the shapes that I put in are within this 2x2x2 or 1 radius bounds. So now I've got all my shapes selected, and I just hide the TP for now. So by default it is cycling shapes, and I can also make it random, but what it's doing is it's kind of distributing them evenly. So we have 33% red blood cells, 33% platelets, and 33% T-cells. There is something called a shape index channel, and this is a channel that Frost looks for, and if it can find it, it will use that. So if you think like scripting, indexing, in Frost it starts for 1, but what I can do is I can say, take some particles, assign them an index of 1, and then when Frost reads it, it knows those particles are going to be red blood cells, the ones with index of 2 are going to be platelets, and the index of 3 will be T-cells. So we want to set up this shape index channel, export it from TP, so we can specifically choose what particles are what shapes. And yeah, we'll do that now. So back into TP, We'll go to spawn cells. Make a little bit of room. So what I will do first of all is assign a random to the particle between 0 and 100 because I like working with percentages, so that makes sense to me. And then I'm going to create 3 thresholds, one for each type of cell. So if this is the threshold of the red blood cell, this is the threshold of the platelet, and this is the threshold of the T cell. And let's say I want the red blood cells to be between 0 and 50%. I want the platelet to be between 50 and 90%. And then I want from 90 to 100% to be the T cells. And those are my proportions. And this will output true if it's between 0 and 50, true if it's between 50 and 90, and so on. So next would be to create an expression. And I'm just going to create a very simple if statement. So if something is true, output this, otherwise output something else. So let's say if Boolean A, so this Boolean here, I'll just call it Boolean A for now. You can call it whatever you want. If this equals true, or 1 in this case, I want it to output an index of 1. Otherwise, I want it to do something else. And this something else is going to be another if. So if this doesn't equal, or this isn't true, I want it to go on and look at this one and see if this one's true. So I've embedded another if statement. I'll look at Boolean B, see whether that's true. If that's true, I'll output an index of 2, otherwise something else. I could add another if statement, or I could just like predictively think that if it's not any of the first 2, then it must be a T cell and output index 3. And I'll just run this through Notepad just to check that all the brackets are closed, which they are. And now I just need to create those inputs. So I'll create my bool A input, my bool B input, and my bool C in. Plug the relevant booleans in, and create the output. Just call it out. And then just like I did before, I'm going to use a memory channel so I can save this to the particle. And I'll just call this memory shape index. We'll create an integer because we're working with indexes, and I'll call it shape index. Input, and save that out. So now if we create another dynamic just after this, and we'll call this assign shape, and I'll just cut these cells, paste, and I'll switch this to a sphere now. So now what I want to do is I want to take that shape index memory that we've made. We've created our shape index, we've proportioned the cells out or ratioed the cells out how we want, and now we want to use this to kind of figure out or assign 3 different sizes based on what index they are. So we'll call the shape index, and we'll use another expression, and it'll be very similar to the first expression we did. It's an if statement. So we'll say if index is equal to 1, if it's the first index, we're going to output size A, otherwise we'll do something else. And what we'll do is another if statement embedded in there, and we'll look at if index equals 2, we'll output size B. And we could do another if statement and keep going, but we're just again going to predict if it's not the first 2, then it's just going to default to size C. And again, I'll just open this in Notepad and just check that all the brackets are closed, which they are. And now I just create my inputs. So I'm taking the index or the shape index. I'm going to have 2 or 3 sizes, size A, size B, and size C, if I can spell. I just create floats for them. Again, just rename this size RBC, size platelet, and size T-cell, and say the cell, red blood cells 20, platelets 5, so much smaller, and then the T-cell is something like 35 or something quite large, and we'll plug them in. So again, what should hopefully happen is if the index output here is 1, it's going to feed through this size. If it's index 2, it will feed through this size, and if it's index 3, it will feed through this size. And we'll just create the output, just call it out. And we'll plug that into size, hopefully, if everything went well. There we go. We have these very large spheres, which are T-cells that don't appear very often. We have pretty much a 50-50 split between our red blood cells and our platelets. And you can see our platelets are much smaller than our red blood cells. So within the one group, we actually have 3 different sizes, 3 different indexes. And like I said, it keeps it very compact. It means that I can move these cells through many, many groups as I do lots of different behavior to them, without having 3 groups every time, one for the red blood cells, one for the platelets, and one for the T cells. Just might increase this a little bit more. So now we've got this all working inside TP, and obviously because they're sized correct, we're going to get accurate bullet collision. We want to export this to Frost so Frost can read this. We've got 2 steps to do here. So the first thing we have to do is create that channel that Frost is looking for, and then we have to set what value we want that to be. So if we go to active bullet, just because that's going to have all the hierarchy of the stuff that we want to mesh. If you click on the groups, you've got this little data channel window, and we can type in, and we have to call it exactly what Frost is looking for. So capital S, capital I, no space. And we also have to have the right file type. We know it's, or data type, sorry. We know it's an integer. So we add this, it's set it to channel 0, and we have this being exported from TP, and it'll export that. If we go down to like the child in the hierarchy, that also has that shape index data assigned to it. So now that's being exported from TP, we just need to set what that's going to be. So I'll just create a dynamic called export shape index. I'll take my active bullet. The node I want to use is a data channel node. We're using data channel 0, which again is what this is set to, channel 0, so that's fine. If we expose the integer, because we're using an integer data type, and we'll just use an integer value for now just to debug it, so we'll set that to 2. If we go back into Frost, set this to use the shape index that we've just created, and hopefully it works. Okay, yeah, we just had to give it a little nudge on the timeline to update TP. So it's showing our platelet mesh, which is kind of what I expect. So like I said, indexing in Frost starts at 1 and not 0, like most kind of scripting applications. And it works that this is index 1, 2, and 3, so it kind of goes from top to bottom. So we're currently looking at index 2, which is our platelet. If we change this to 3, it should be showing the T-cell mesh. Let's set this to that. Give it a bit of a jiggle. So that's showing our T-cell now, and if we set that to 1, it will be the red blood cell, hopefully. And you can see like it's a little slow to like process all this mesh in the viewport, which is one of the reasons I like breaking the high res off from the TP system. Now obviously we don't want to have one index, we want to use that memory from earlier. So we can just pull the memory in, pull out that shape index channel, plug it in, and fingers crossed, yeah, the platelets are the smaller particles, the red blood cells are the middle-sized particles, and then we have the much larger T cells here. So that's all working as we want it to. And there's a few other data channels that Frost can pick up. So if I click on this, we can do the same for material ID. So we can use MTL index, or quite handily, we can actually take the ID from the shape number. So if we're using a multi-sub material, it will default 1 will be our RBC and all that stuff. There's also a very interesting one that I used. If you saw the web publication for the bacteria dividing, there's one for animation timing, and that's called geom time. So if you have animation on your instance mesh, you can choose what frame you want to play. And in fact, if we go back to the video, that appears in this system as well. So these platelets are these flat disc-like shapes in the blood vessel. When they bind, they grow these tentacles, and the way that's happening is when they bind, they're sent to a group activates a timer. That timer is exported as the geom time, and that's how it knows how to play out this animation, and the animation is just a morph target setup. So it's like I said, TP and Frost really good together. All right. So hide the Frost, go back into TV. So one thing I forgot to do, if we play the system out at the moment, one problem we will have, I might have to make it a bit longer on the timeline. So as these get towards the end of the path, they're going to bunch up, and especially with bullet physics on, that's going to kind of be a problem. They're just going to like create this massive clot of cells at the end. So what we want to do is kind of delete these cells when they get to the end of the path to keep the system nice and light. We don't want to like be rendering unnecessary particles and physics simulation. There's a few ways we could go about this. We could create like a sphere in the scene and use like an in mesh, so when the particles go inside the volume, they get sent to a group that kills them. But I kind of want to do a bit more procedural approach. So if I come into the helpers, rename this path follow. What I want to do is spawn a point at the end of the path, helper endpoint, make it magenta. Nope. Okay, so just spawn one particle into the helper endpoint, make it live forever and no speed. And then in the path follow, we just mash lots of 9s into the start value, so it's always going to spawn at the end of the path. So if I give this a little jiggle, I'll assign a shape to it so it's a bit easier to see. Yes, yeah. So we got this this particle that's always going to spawn at the end of the path, no matter kind of what we do to the path. So if we came in here and moved the path like this and updated it, it would then spawn at the end of this path. And this is why I prefer this as opposed to creating like a sphere in the scene, because this is a little bit more procedural, a procedural approach. There is sort of an issue where if we were to add the noise to the path, because the path follows being assigned to the born particle and not the group, it doesn't update every frame. So you can see it's not hard forming to the path like the other cells, but I mean, it's not really that important. I mean, the path's not moving around too much, so I could sort of put this into another dynamic and link a group to it, but it's fine just on the born particle for what I need. And then create create a delete at end dynamic, and I'm just going to use a very simple p-pass-ab. So I take my endpoint, I'm going to draw a radius of, say, like 100 units around it. So if you imagine this point has got a radius of 100 around it, we're going to look at any cells, and if there's a cell that appears in that radius, it'll output particle B, and I throw that straight into a particle die. So what we should end up with is these particles travel along the path, and as they get within this 100 unit radius, they're being deleted, and we just want to like duplicate this p-pass-ab setup and just make sure we get the path follow helpers as well. And what we can do, which is something I like a lot, is if we expose the distance for both of these nodes, we can end up with the same value to control both of them. So even though we've got like two p-passes, we don't have to like go into each of them, and if we want to adjust the distance, we can just create this kind of global value here.
And I didn't see, did you make them die off instantly or fade out as they approach? What did you set in particular? Okay, 0, so they instantly die. Okay.
Yeah.
You could give them 2 frames to shrink down or whatever. But right now for this, it's okay, you just kill them at the end.
Yeah, for like something like, if we go back to the animation, like the leaking, so we can see like, it's maybe a little bit tricky, but you can see some of the cells go out here and then kind of scale down so they don't die abruptly. Yep. But for like the end of the vessel, because it's off camera, we never see it, we can just like hard kill them basically. So we have our lovely system, we've got all this lovely rotation and all that stuff. This is now the base blood vessel setup. So the next step would be to start looking at how we can do like clotting and other stuff. So I'll just create another dynamic called clot, just so this can all be as one collapse bit. Send to clot. So what I'm going to do, I'll just put it on that layer. If we go back to the animation for reference, I'm going to look at how we can get these platelets to start creating this first layer of sealing this rupture. Mm-hmm. So I create a little sphere in the scene like this. I'll just make it display as box so it's a little easier to see what's going on. I do another group here, we'll call this clot level 1. So if we take our cells, send them to this clot level 1 group based on a condition, and our condition will be an in-mesh.
So what are you doing now is sorting just the particles into a different group based on whatever condition you're setting up right now.
Yep. So in this case, if they go inside this, I guess for like newer people of TP, there's this whole second tab here, or these conditions, and these are all kind of ways of affecting Boolean values that can be used to turn a node on and off. So one thing I like a lot in here is any node. So if I go to like a mass node or a size node, every node in TP you can expose an on, which allows you to turn this node on or off. So the kind of logic here is I send these cells to another group, but then choose when this node is on, which determines obviously when they then get sent to this group. So the logic, or the condition I'm using, is an in-mesh. So when they go in this volume here, let's see if that works. We'll just add a quick debug just to check whether this works fine, and we'll just add it like some crazy gravity or something. So when they go into this sphere, they get pulled down. Now, the problem we've got here is every cell is being affected, and in the animation we only want platelets to be picked up. But this is quite easy to do. We've already got our shape index memory, so we can create the memory, recall that shape index that we've created from earlier, and we can chain multiple conditions together using the AND help. Is it helper? Yeah,
it's a math helper.
Helper, yeah. So it allows us to chain multiple booleans together. So we know that the platelet is a shape index of 2. So if we take a threshold, we take our shape index and we want to make sure that it's within 2. So we're dealing with only index of 2. And we say, okay, it has to be an index of 2 and in that volume for it to be affected. So what should happen now is only platelets are changing group and then having this gravity applied to them. Gravity might be bad. Maybe if I just do straight velocity going down, that might look a bit better. Well, that's going up. And a little bit more. So there we go. So only the platelets are being picked out. And that's also not, I guess it's because they've still got a lot of motion, so I can just add friction to that or something. Ooh. But anyway, it gives you kind of a gist of what's happening. What I could do is further go in here and say, okay, well, I don't want every platelet inside the bloodstream to go to this clot because it might look a little strange. So I can then say, okay, well, I create a random between 0 and 100 again because I like working with percentages. We want to use a different seed. This has tripped me up a few times because we're using a random to choose what shape that they're using. If we use the same seed, we can get very bizarre behavior because they're already being sorted using a random seed.
Yep.
So we just want to make sure this is a completely different seed. And then again, we can change like another threshold. So we say, okay, they have to be index 2, they have to be in that mesh, and we will only let 50% of them through. So we still keep some of them in the bloodstream, so it still looks reasonably natural, but we're having platelets that are going to this other group. And then obviously we can make it so there is a bring to or a position follow or whatever. So let's go into here, we'll rename this plot, we'll remove this guy, and I should have in the scene so I have this little sort of Pringle shaped geometry. Hopefully you guys know what Pringles are. They're like crisp over here.
It's exactly what it looks like. That's a Pringle. That's a Pringle. Good modeling there.
Just got to be like with a worldwide release. Just got to make sure everyone knows what a Pringle is.
Yeah, I'm sure they know it.
So I can do something like take the node, sample a surface position from that Pringle shape, and then do a bring to or a position follow, depending on what you sort of think is nicer. Bring to is quite nice because you can do it in terms of frames, and you can also do alignment, but sometimes position follow, you can get a smoother animation into it. I also just want to make sure that I'm plugging the particle into the surface position. If I don't do that, it gets a new position on the surface every frame, so you get this crazy flickering mass here because they're getting a different position to go to every frame. But if I plug the particle in here, it will lock it, so it'll always have the same position. And then we've got that. So in the final animation, I kind of set it that it kind of binds to the edges first, and then kind of gradiently moves over. So the way I did that was I spawned particles on the Pringle shape using a matter waves. I used an in mesh to kind of activate them. So I had a cylinder that started this large and then kind of scaled down, and when they became the invert of in that cylinder, so when they became outside that cylinder, they got sent to the activation group, and then the platelets could hunt them out. And that just gave me a little bit more artistic control. But yeah, so that's kind of how we can take this basic blood vessel setup and then start moving it through groups, and then even still use that indexing that we've made to filter these cells. And then it's just about layering on all the various behaviors we want. So first level of clot, the second level of clot, fibrin growing over it, and then the clot breaking off.
It's very good.
And I kind of mentioned it, but what we could do is how we could do this now. Quick. When we send them to the clot, call it timer activate. So when they get sent to this clot group, we use that to start this timer. And this timer is over 30 frames. If we change it to like 50 frames or something. If we go back to our spawn cells group, we just want to add another memory here, and we'll add a scalar memory called geom time. And again, just set that to 0. So now, so to explain what we're doing, we want to have it so when the platelets bind on the first layer, they then start animating these tentacles. And so the way I've set that up, if I go to this guy here, this is my platelet, and I have a morph target that just animates over 0 to 50 frames, where it grows into this tentacle shape. So what I want to do is be able to choose in Frost when to play back this animation. So up until when it gets to that clot, I want it to just be holding the first frame 0, and then when it gets into that clot level 1 group, I want it to start playing that animation at normal speed. So yeah, I'm triggering this timer, and then I will recall this geom time. Oh, wrong one. And again, because we're not affecting this geom time at any other point, it's just going to stay at 0 from when we set it. But on the timer, we're going to pump this in. So I usually just put take the time relative, plunk it into a value to value, and then I can remap it. But I could probably also just output like the timer value straight into the geom time or something like that. I mean, value to value I quite like for like scaling down. If you want to do a scale down operation or something like that, is because you can then add curves. So you can add ease ins and ease outs and all that stuff. So timer relative is just the normalized version of the timer between 0 and 50. And I want to map that 0 to 1 to 0 and 50 if it's 50 frames. Plug that into the geom time. Okay, and if we go back to our active bullet, we want to add another channel called geom time. So this is now on channel 1. So at the end of clot, we'll create another dynamic called export geom time. We'll take our active bullet, recall our memory, and plug that into a data channel. And this data channel is data channel 1 now, the geom time data channel, and it's a float. If we wire that up, that's now TP exporting our geom time channel, and Frost will be able to read that if we just set it here. So we use the geom time channel and we use time 0, and that will lead us to this where we can play animations. And again, I used it in the the bacteria dividing. So when the bacteria were dividing, I used TP for the particle motions, but I wanted like bulging in the middle as it started to split, just to give that little bit of artistic control. So that's when I decided to play back some hand animation on top of the TP system. And so you get all the advantages of TP, all the lovely movement and the scale that you can get from having so many particles, but then you can still have that hand control where it really counts.
And what you did here is really also interesting. What you're actually doing is you're controlling the animation outside of TP in a third-party plugin. So TP is able to send out the information needed to control the animation outside of 3D Studio Max.
Yep. Like I said, they communicate together very, very well, and yeah, love it.